I was standing in my front yard when I realized everything I had spent 3 years collecting was gone, and in its place sat a pile of newly laid sod and generic landscaping rocks that probably cost $12 at the hardware store. My name is Quentin Zimmerman, and I had just returned from a 2-week paleontology conference in Montana, where I had presented findings on Cretaceous marine fossils. The conference had gone well, maybe too well, because I had stayed an extra 3 days networking with colleagues from the University of Denver. During that time, my carefully curated rock garden in Phoenix, Arizona had apparently been deemed an eyesore by someone who had no idea what they were looking at. I dropped my suitcase on the driveway and walked closer to where my garden used to be. The southwestern corner of my property had featured over 200 specimens that I had personally excavated, traded for, or purchased from reputable dealers over the past 3 years. There had been trilobites from Utah, ammonites from South Dakota, petrified wood sections from the petrified forest, and my prize piece, a nearly complete mosasaur vertebra from Kansas that alone was worth over $800. Now there was nothing but generic river stones and St. Augustine grass. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. The landscaping was fresh, probably done within the last 48 hours based on how green the sod looked. Someone had been watering it. I walked around to the side of my house and checked the gate. It was still locked from the inside, which meant whoever did this had accessed my property from the front. I was about to call the police when my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, came hurrying across her lawn. She was in her 70s and had always been kind to me since I moved into the Saguaro Heights subdivision 4 years ago. "Quentin, thank goodness you are back," she said, slightly out of breath. "I tried calling you, but it kept going to voicemail. I was on a plane most of yesterday." "Mrs. Patterson, what happened to my garden?" She looked genuinely distressed. "It was that new HOA president, Brenda Morrison. She came by 3 days ago with a crew and said your rock collection was in violation of some clause about yard debris and aesthetic standards. I told her those were not regular rocks, that you were a scientist, but she would not listen. She just removed them without contacting me. She said she had sent you multiple notices. I saw her take pictures before they hauled everything away in a truck. Quentin, I am so sorry." I thought about calling the police, but she had paperwork, official-looking documents. I did not know what to do. I thanked Mrs. Patterson and went inside. My house was exactly as I had left it, which meant they had only targeted the front yard. I immediately went to my home office and checked my mail, both physical and email. There was nothing from the HOA, not a single notice. I had been meticulous about checking my mail before I left, and I had set up forwarding for anything important. The HOA folder in my filing cabinet had the usual monthly newsletters and the occasional reminder about trash day, but there were no warnings about my rock garden. I had received one notice about it when I first installed it 3 years ago, but that had been resolved when I provided documentation showing that it was an educational display and fell under the provisions for personal hobby installations, as long as it was maintained and did not exceed certain height restrictions. I pulled out that old correspondence. The previous HOA president, a reasonable man named Gary Chen, had approved my garden in writing. The letter was dated and signed. My rock garden had never exceeded 3 feet in height, was organized in neat terrace sections, and I had even installed small identification plaques for the most significant specimens. It was not debris. It was a curated collection. My phone rang. It was my colleague, Dr. Sarah Martinez, from Arizona State University, where I worked as an associate professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration. "Quentin, How was the flight back? Sarah, I need your help. My entire fossil collection from my front yard is gone. The HOA removed it while I was away. There was a pause. Your garden, the one you have been building for years, that garden, every single piece. Quentin, some of those specimens were worth serious money. That mosasaur vertebra you showed me last month, you said that was nearly $1,000. 850, and that is just one piece. I had Devonian trilobites, Jurassic ammonites, specimens that took me months to prepare. This is going to be at least $30,000 in total value, maybe more. You need a lawyer. This is not just an HOA dispute. This is theft and destruction of property. Do you have documentation of your collection? I did. Every specimen had been photographed, cataloged, and entered into a database I maintained for insurance purposes. I had appraisals for the most valuable pieces. I had receipts, provenance documentation, everything a serious collector maintains. I have everything documented. Good. I know someone who might be able to help. Her name is Amanda Richardson. She is a real estate attorney, but she has dealt with HOA disputes before. Let me text you her number. After hanging up with Sarah, I spent the next hour photographing where my garden used to be and pulling together all my documentation. The more I looked at my records, the angrier I became. This was not just about money. Some of those specimens represented weeks of work in the field. The petrified wood sections had come from a dig I did with my father before he passed away 2 years ago. They had sentimental value that could not be replaced. I called the number Sarah sent me. A receptionist answered and I explained my situation. To my surprise, Amanda Richardson herself picked up within minutes. Mr. Zimmerman, Sarah just texted me about your situation. This sounds serious. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning at 9? I can be there today if you have time. Let me check. There was a pause. I had a cancellation at 3. Can you make that? I could and did. Her office was in downtown Phoenix, in one of those modern buildings near the courthouse. Amanda Richardson turned out to be a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and an immediately professional demeanor that put me at ease. I laid out everything for her. The photos of my original garden, the current state of my yard, the documentation of my collection, the previous approval from the old HOA president, and the complete lack of any recent notices warning me about a violation. She went through everything carefully, taking notes on a legal pad. This is clear-cut. They had no right to remove your property without proper notice, even if there was a violation, which I do not believe there was based on this approval letter. The fact that you received no notice makes this even worse. This is destruction of property at minimum, possibly theft depending on what happened to your specimens. What do I do? First, we send a formal demand letter to the HOA and this Brenda Morrison personally. We demand the immediate return of all specimens and compensation for any that were damaged or destroyed. Second, if they do not comply within 72 hours, we file a lawsuit. Third, and I strongly recommend this, you file a police report for theft. Will the police take this seriously? Property valued at $30,000. Absolutely. This is not a small claims matter. This is a felony theft depending on the total value and whether it can be proven they acted with intent to deprive you of your property permanently. I left her office feeling somewhat better. At least I had a plan. I went directly to the Phoenix Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement seemed skeptical at first until I showed him the documentation and the photographs of some of my more impressive specimens. So these are not just regular rocks. No, sir. These are fossils, some of them millions of years old. This mosasaur vertebra, for instance, is from an extinct marine reptile that lived 70 million years ago. That piece alone is worth over $800 to collectors and researchers." His eyebrows went up. "And you are saying the HOA just hauled all of this away, while I was out of town, without notice, and without my permission?" He typed for a while longer. "Okay, Mr. Zimmerman, I am filing this as theft of property over $10,000. That makes it a Class 3 felony in Arizona if we can prove intent. Someone will be in contact with you. In the meantime, do not disturb the area where the rocks used to be. That is technically a crime scene now." I drove home and put up some temporary fencing around the area with a sign that said, "Crime scene, do not disturb," just to make sure nobody touched anything. Mrs. Patterson came over again that evening with a casserole. "I heard you putting up that fence. Is everything okay?" I filed a police report. "Mrs. Patterson, did you see what they did with the rocks? Where did they take them?" She thought for a moment. "The truck drove off toward the main entrance of the subdivision. I remember thinking it seemed overly full, piled quite high." "It was a white pickup truck, fairly large, maybe a Ford F-350. Did you see a company name on it?" "No, but I did see who was driving. It was Brenda's son, Kyle. He has done work for the HOA before, landscaping and such." This was important information. I texted Amanda Richardson immediately, and she replied that this was excellent, that it established a direct connection and could prove that Brenda had used personal resources for HOA business, which might violate their own bylaws. The next morning, I woke up to find a notice taped to my front door. It was from the HOA, dated that very day, threatening to fine me for the crime scene signs and temporary fencing I had put up. The letter said these were not approved modifications and violated the aesthetic standards of the community. I could not believe the audacity. I took a picture of the notice and sent it to Amanda immediately. She called me back within the hour. "This is incredible. They are actually digging themselves deeper. I am drafting the demand letter now. We are going to include this notice as evidence of harassment and retaliation." "Quentin, do you have the contact information for the HOA board? I need official addresses for service." I did. The HOA had a website with a directory. Besides Brenda Morrison, there were 4 other board members. I had met a few of them at community events but did not know them well. Amanda's demand letter went out that afternoon via certified mail and email. It was 10 pages long and laid out everything in excruciating detail. The letter demanded the return of all specimens within 72 hours, compensation for any damaged or destroyed items based on appraised values, compensation for emotional distress, and an official apology. The letter also demanded that the HOA pay for restoration of my yard to its original condition, including proper soil preparation for reinstallation of my collection. The response came faster than I expected, but not from Brenda Morrison. It came from the HOA's attorney, a man named Peter Walsh. His letter was brief and dismissive. It claimed that the removal of yard debris and unsightly rocks was within the HOA's rights under Section 7.3 of the Community Bylaws, which gave the board authority to remove violations without notice if they deemed it an emergency affecting community standards. Amanda called me after receiving this response. "They are claiming emergency removal. That is interesting because emergency removal provisions typically apply to things like dead trees that might fall on a house or health hazards, not someone's rock collection. I think we have grounds to argue they abused their emergency powers. So what happens now? Now we file suit. I am drafting the complaint today. We are going to sue the HOA, Brenda Morrison personally, and her son Kyle Morrison for theft, destruction of property, breach of contract, and violation of your property rights." We are asking for the full value of your collection plus punitive damages. How much are we talking about? Based on your documentation, I would say we ask for at least $50,000 in actual damages and another $50,000 in punitive damages. The actual amount will depend on what we can prove and what a jury awards, but we need to set our damages high to show we are serious. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. I was served my own copy as the plaintiff, and the HOA and the Morrisons were served theirs. The local process server told Amanda that Brenda Morrison had been furious when she received the papers, actually screaming at him that this was ridiculous and that I was wasting everyone's time. What happened next caught me completely off guard. 2 days after the lawsuit was filed, I came home to find that someone had spray painted the word "troublemaker" across my garage door in red paint. My mailbox had been knocked over, and my trash cans were dumped across my driveway. I called the police immediately. The same officer who had taken my original report came out. "Mr. Zimmerman, this looks like retaliation. Have you had any direct contact with the HOA since you filed your lawsuit?" "No, none at all. Everything has gone through my attorney. He took photos and filed another report. I am going to recommend we open an investigation into the HOA president and her son. This pattern of behavior suggests harassment. Do you have any security cameras?" I did not, but I immediately ordered some that day. They arrived 2 days later and I installed them myself, covering my front door, driveway, and the side of my house. Amanda was livid when I told her about the vandalism. "This is exactly what we need. This shows their state of mind." We are going to amend the complaint to include harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Quentin, document everything. Every interaction, every notice, every suspicious thing that happens. The HOA's next move was to call an emergency community meeting. The notice said the meeting was to discuss frivolous litigation affecting community resources and finances. They scheduled it for a Saturday morning at the community center. I debated whether to attend. Amanda advised me that I did not have to, but that it might be useful to see what they said, as long as I remained calm and did not engage. I decided to go. The community center was packed when I arrived. There were probably 60 people there, which was unusual for HOA meetings. Normally, these things drew maybe 10 residents. Brenda Morrison stood at the front with a microphone. She was exactly what you would expect from someone who would destroy a fossil collection. A woman in her mid-50s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut, expensive athleisure wear, and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she had never been told no in her life. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "I want to address the situation with Mr. Zimmerman directly so there is no confusion in our community." Mr. Zimmerman decided to turn his front yard into what can only be described as a rock pile, lowering all of our property values and making our neighborhood look trashy. When we, acting within our rights as the HOA board, corrected this violation, he decided to sue us for $100,000 of your money. There were gasps from the audience. I felt my face getting hot, but I stayed quiet. This lawsuit is not just against the HOA. It is against every homeowner here because we all fund the HOA. Mr. Zimmerman wants to take money out of our community funds, money that could go to maintaining our common areas, our pool, our landscaping, and use it to pay for his rock collection. I think that is selfish and wrong. An older man in the back raised his hand. "Brenda, I heard those were not just rocks. I heard they were fossils worth a lot of money." "They were rocks," Brenda said firmly. "Rocks piled up in his yard." There is no difference between expensive rocks and cheap rocks when it comes to our community standards. We do not allow rock piles, period. I could not stay quiet anymore. I stood up. That is not true, and you know it. I had prior approval for my garden from the previous HOA president. I have it in writing. And they were not just rocks, they were scientifically valuable fossils that I had documented and insured. Some of them were irreplaceable specimens that I collected with my late father. You had no right to remove them without notice. The room went silent. Brenda's face turned red. You were sent multiple notices. That is a lie. I received nothing. I checked my mail, my email, everything. You removed my property while I was out of town without warning, and now you are trying to cover it up. This is not the appropriate venue for this discussion, Brenda said, her voice tight. If you have complaints, take them through the proper channels. I did. I filed a lawsuit because you committed theft. Several people in the audience started talking at once. Someone said they wanted to see the prior approval I mentioned. Someone else said they had always thought my rock garden looked nice. A woman near the front said she thought the HOA had overstepped. Brenda tried to regain control of the meeting, but it was clear she had lost the room. People were upset, not at me, but at the board for spending community money on legal fees to defend what was increasingly looking like an illegal action. The meeting broke up early with no clear resolution. As I was walking to my car, a man approached me. He was in his 40s, tall with graying hair. Mr. Zimmerman, I am David Chen. My father was Gary Chen, the previous HOA president. Oh, I am so sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man. Thank you. He passed last year, which is how Brenda ended up as president. Nobody else wanted to run, and she was the only one on the ballot. Listen, I want you to know that my father would be appalled by what she did. He specifically told me about your rock garden when you first installed it. He thought it was one of the nicest features in the neighborhood. He said you were a real scientist and that the community should be proud to have someone like you here. I felt my throat tighten. That means a lot to me. Thank you for telling me. If you need someone to testify about my father's approval, I would be happy to. I am pretty sure I still have some of his old HOA files in storage. This was exactly what I needed. I gave David my attorney's contact information and thanked him profusely. When I told Amanda about this development, she was thrilled. Having the son of the previous president testify is perfect. It establishes continuity and shows that the prior approval was legitimate and not some misunderstanding. This is great news. The criminal investigation was moving forward as well. The detective assigned to my case, a woman named Detective Lisa Torres, called me in for a follow-up interview. She had been investigating the Morrison family and had some interesting findings. Mr. Zimmerman, we pulled records for Kyle Morrison's landscaping business. In the past year, he has received over $40,000 in payments from the HOA for various projects. That is a lot of work, especially for a community this size. It raises questions about whether Brenda has been funneling HOA money to her son. Is that illegal? If there was no competitive bidding and she did not disclose the conflict of interest, yes. It could be embezzlement or fraud, depending on how it was structured. We are also trying to locate your fossils. Do you know if Kyle Morrison has a storage unit or property where he might have taken them? I have no idea. We are working on getting a warrant to search his business premises. The challenge is that if he disposed of them, threw them in a landfill for instance, they may be gone forever. That thought made me sick. Literally irreplaceable specimens, potentially sitting in a landfill somewhere because someone thought they were ugly rocks. The following week, my attorney filed a motion for summary judgment on certain aspects of the case. She argued that based on the undisputed facts, the prior approval letter, and the lack of any notice before removal, There was no genuine dispute that the HOA had violated my rights. The motion asked the judge to rule in our favor on liability, leaving only damages to be determined at trial. The hearing on the motion was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, discovery was proceeding. Amanda had subpoenaed all of the HOA's records, including financial records, board meeting minutes, and email correspondence. What came back was damning. There were emails between Brenda and her son discussing my rock garden going back 6 months. In one email, Kyle suggested that if they removed it, he could replace it with new landscaping and charge the HOA for the work. In another, Brenda complained that my garden made the neighborhood look like a geology museum and that it needed to go. There was no mention in any of the emails of sending me notices or following proper procedures. In fact, one email from Brenda to another board member said, "We will deal with him when he gets back. By then it will be done and he cannot stop us." This showed premeditation and intent. It also showed that Brenda knew what she was doing might be legally questionable, but she did it anyway. Amanda was practically gleeful when she showed me these emails. This is what we call smoking gun evidence. They cannot claim this was a good faith mistake or following proper procedures. This was a deliberate act to remove your property while you were gone so you could not stop them. A jury is going to hate this. But the most shocking discovery came from the financial records. Kyle Morrison had indeed received over $40,000 from the HOA in the past year, but that was not the worst part. When Amanda dug deeper, she found that Brenda had approved these payments without board votes. She had essentially been writing checks to her son without oversight. Moreover, there were charges for work that had never been done. One invoice showed payment for tree trimming in the common areas, but when Amanda drove through the neighborhood, there were no trees in the common areas. Another invoice was for irrigation repair at the community pool, but the pool did not have an irrigation system. This was fraud. Amanda immediately sent this information to Detective Torres and also filed a motion to amend the complaint to add fraud and embezzlement claims. The HOA board seemed to wake up to how serious this was becoming. 3 of the 4 other board members resigned. A special election was called for a new board. In the meantime, the remaining board member, a retired accountant named Henry Sullivan, took over as acting president. Henry called me personally, which I found surprising. "Mr. Zimmerman, I want to apologize on behalf of the HOA. When I reviewed the records, I was shocked by what Mrs. Morrison had been doing. Most of us on the board were not aware of the day-to-day decisions she was making. She told us she handled the small stuff and we trusted her. That was clearly a mistake. I appreciate the apology, Mr. Sullivan, but I need my fossils back. Do you know what happened to them? I honestly do not. I have been trying to find out. I reached out to Kyle Morrison, but he is not returning my calls. His attorney told me to stop contacting him. I am sorry. I know that is not helpful." It was not, but at least someone from the HOA was being reasonable. Henry told me that the HOA's insurance company was now involved, and they were conducting their own investigation. Apparently, the insurance company was not happy about potentially having to pay out a large claim due to Brenda's actions. The criminal investigation heated up when Detective Torres obtained a warrant and searched Kyle Morrison's business premises. They found some of my specimens in a storage shed behind his office. Not all of them, but enough to be significant. There were about 30 rocks, including several valuable trilobites and some of the petrified wood sections, but these pieces were in bad shape. They had been thrown in a pile, not carefully stored. Several trilobites were cracked. One of the petrified wood sections had been broken in half, likely from being tossed around. I went to identify them at the police evidence facility, and I nearly cried when I saw the condition they were in. "Mr. Zimmerman, can you estimate the damage?" Detective Torres asked. I went through each piece carefully, documenting the damage. Of the 30 specimens they recovered, almost all had some damage. The total loss in value from the damage alone was probably $5,000. That was on top of the fact that over 170 specimens were still missing. "Where are the rest?" I asked Kyle's attorney, who was present during the identification. "My client has no knowledge of any other rocks," he said stiffly. "These are not rocks, they are fossils, and your client absolutely knows where they are because he is the one who took them." The attorney did not respond, but Detective Torres assured me that the investigation was ongoing. They had pulled Kyle's phone records and were tracking his movements on the day the fossils were removed. Apparently, he had driven to a construction waste facility in South Phoenix after leaving my neighborhood. Detective Torres and 2 other officers went to the facility with a warrant. The facility handled clean fill, basically dirt and rock, and they had records of Kyle making a dump there 3 weeks earlier. The load weight was logged at over 3,000 pounds, which was consistent with my entire rock collection. The problem was that the facility did not separate loads. Everything that came in got crushed and mixed together, then sold as fill material for construction projects. My fossils, my carefully curated collection that I had spent years building, had literally been crushed into gravel. When Detective Torres called to tell me this, I could not even respond at first. I just sat there holding the phone, feeling numb. "Mr. Zimmerman, I am so sorry. I know this is not the outcome you wanted. They crushed them. They crushed millions of years of history into road fill. I know. Based on this evidence, we are moving forward with felony charges against both Brenda Morrison and Kyle Morrison. They will be charged with theft, fraud, and destruction of property. The district attorney's office is preparing the formal charges now. The criminal charges were filed 2 days later. Brenda and Kyle were both arrested. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, I was getting calls from reporters wanting interviews. I declined most of them, but I did agree to speak with one reporter from the Arizona Republic because I wanted to get the truth out there. The story ran on the front page of the local section. The headline read, "HOA President Arrested After Destroying Scientists' Fossil Collection." The article laid out the whole situation, included photos of my original garden, and had quotes from me about the scientific and personal value of what had been destroyed. It also included the detail about the embezzlement and fraud charges related to payments to Kyle. The community response was overwhelming. I received dozens of messages from neighbors apologizing and expressing support. Several people offered to help me rebuild my collection. One man, who had done archaeological work in his youth, actually gave me 3 trilobites he had collected decades ago. Another neighbor organized a fundraiser to help offset my losses, but the legal process was just beginning. The civil case was still moving forward. The summary judgment hearing was held in late August. I attended with Amanda. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Wu, had clearly read all the briefs thoroughly. "Miss Richardson, your motion argues that liability is established as a matter of law. Mr. Walsh, you argue that there are disputed issues requiring a trial. Let me hear from both of you." Peter Walsh, the HOA's attorney, went first. He tried to argue that the emergency removal provision gave the HOA broad discretion, and that my garden had violated community standards even if I had prior approval, because standards could change. Judge Wu interrupted him. "Counsel, How can you argue that standards changed when your client sent no notice to Mr. Zimmerman about any new standards? He had written approval. That approval was never formally revoked. Under basic contract law, you cannot unilaterally revoke an agreement without notice. Your Honor, the HOA bylaws allow the board to act with discretion in the interest of the community. Discretion does not mean unlimited power. Miss Richardson, Amanda stood up. Your Honor, the evidence is clear. My client had written approval for his rock garden. He received no notice of any violation. The HOA removed his property while he was out of town, in an action that emails show was premeditated and designed to avoid giving him a chance to object. Moreover, the property they removed was not debris or trash, but valuable fossils that were documented, insured, and maintained. This was not an emergency situation. There was no justification for removal without notice. We ask the court to grant summary judgment on liability. Judge Wu asked several more questions, probing the details of the prior approval and the lack of notice. Finally, she made her ruling. I am going to grant the motion for summary judgment on liability. The undisputed facts establish that the HOA violated Mr. Zimmerman's property rights. The question of damages will proceed to trial, but liability is established. Mr. Zimmerman is entitled to compensation for his losses. It was a huge victory. As we left the courtroom, Amanda was smiling. This is excellent. Now we just need to prove damages. With your documentation, that should be straightforward. We also have a much stronger negotiating position now. The HOA knows they lost on liability. They may want to settle rather than risk a jury trial on damages. She was right. 2 weeks later, Henry Sullivan called me directly. Mr. Zimmerman, I want to discuss the possibility of settling this case. The new board has been elected and we have reviewed everything thoroughly. We believe Mrs. Morrison acted inappropriately and outside her authority. We want to make this right. What are you proposing? We are prepared to offer you $40,000 to settle all claims and cover your losses. We would also issue a formal apology and reinstate your prior approval for a rock garden if you wish to rebuild it. I told him I would discuss it with my attorney. Amanda's advice was that $40,000 was reasonable given the circumstances, but that we should counter at $50,000 given the strength of our position after the summary judgment ruling. We countered at $50,000. The HOA came back at $45,000. We settled at $47,500. The agreement included a formal apology, acknowledgement that I had done nothing wrong, reinstatement of my approval to maintain a fossil garden, and a provision that the HOA would pay my attorney's fees, which were another $15,000. The criminal case took longer. Brenda and Kyle both pleaded not guilty initially. But as the evidence mounted and their attorneys reviewed the case, it became clear that a trial would not go well for them. The emails alone were devastating. In December, about 6 months after the initial incident, both Brenda and Kyle agreed to plea deals. Brenda pleaded guilty to felony theft and fraud. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $30,000 jointly with her son. Kyle pleaded guilty to theft and received a similar sentence. Both were permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. The restitution was in addition to the civil settlement, so in total, I received $77,500 in compensation. It was not about the money for me, though. Money could not replace the specimens I had collected with my father or the years of work that went into building and preparing that collection. But I did use the money to start rebuilding. I joined fossil collector groups online and started networking with dealers and other collectors. Some people in the paleontology community, after hearing about what happened, reached out with offers of specimens. A professor at the University of Utah sent me a beautiful ammonite from the Cretaceous. A dealer in South Dakota gave me a discount on some trilobites. Slowly, carefully, I started to rebuild. I also redesigned my garden with better organization and more prominent labeling. This time, I installed security cameras covering the entire display. I put up a small sign explaining that this was an educational fossil display and included my contact information for anyone with questions. I was not going to let fear of the HOA prevent me from pursuing my passion. The new HOA board was much more reasonable. They actually featured my garden in the community newsletter as an example of personal expression and educational value. Henry Sullivan remained as president, and he made it clear that the HOA would be run more transparently and with more respect for homeowner rights. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor, became one of my garden's biggest fans. She would bring visitors by to see it and explain the different specimens. She told me once that she felt terrible about not doing more when Brenda initially removed everything, and this was her way of making it up to me. I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she had been put in an impossible situation. By the spring of the following year, my new garden was taking shape. It was not identical to the original, but it had its own character. I had about 80 specimens installed with room for more. Each was carefully labeled with its scientific name, age, and location of origin. I had trilobites from the Cambrian, ammonites from the Jurassic, shark teeth from the Miocene, and petrified wood from the Triassic. My centerpiece was a gift from Sarah Martinez. She had been on a dig in Wyoming and found a section of hadrosaur rib, a duck-billed dinosaur from the late Cretaceous. It was not as valuable as my lost mosasaur vertebra, but it meant more to me because of the gesture. She had spent hours preparing it in the lab and mounted it on a custom stand for display. I held a small dedication ceremony for the new garden in April. I invited neighbors, colleagues from the university, and members of the local fossil club. About 30 people came. We had coffee and donuts, and I gave a short presentation about the fossils and their significance. David Chen, whose father had originally approved my garden, was there. He gave a short speech about how his father would have loved to see the community come together like this, and how he believed that neighborhoods were stronger when they celebrated their members' interests rather than suppressing them. It was healing in a way I had not expected. The whole terrible experience had brought out the best in many people, even as it exposed the worst in a few others. The final piece of closure came in June, when I received an email from the Arizona Paleontological Society. They had heard about what happened and wanted to give me their Community Education Award for promoting paleontology and standing up for scientific education. The award came with a small grant to help build my collection further. At the award ceremony in Tucson, I gave a speech about the importance of fossils not just for science, but as connections to deep time and to the incredible history of life on Earth. I talked about how my collection had been more than just rocks, that each specimen represented a moment frozen in time, a glimpse into worlds that existed millions of years before humans. I also talked about the importance of fighting for what is right, even when it is difficult. I could have accepted the HOA's destruction of my garden and moved on. Many people would have. But sometimes you have to stand up, not just for yourself, but for the principle that people have rights that cannot be trampled just because someone in a position of minor authority decides they do not like something. The whole experience taught me that HOAs can be a force for good or for bad depending on who is running them, and whether there are proper checks and balances. Brenda Morrison abused her power and caused tremendous damage, not just to my property, but to the trust and cohesion of our community. But the response from the community, once people understood what had really happened, showed that most people are fundamentally fair and reasonable. As I stood in my rebuilt rock garden on a warm evening in June, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the fossilized remains of ancient life, I felt a sense of peace. The garden was not exactly as it had been. Some things could never be replaced. But it was mine again, protected by law and supported by my community. Mrs. Patterson came out of her house and waved at me. "It looks beautiful, Quentin. Your father would be so proud." She was right. My father would have been proud, not just of the garden, but of the fact that I had fought for it and won. He had taught me that things worth having are things worth fighting for, whether it is a fossil you spend days excavating from stone or a principle you spend months defending in court. I walked along the terraced levels of my garden, checking each specimen, making small adjustments to labels and positions. In the fading light, the ancient shells and bones seemed to glow. These creatures had survived in stone for millions of years. They had outlasted countless storms, geological upheavals, and the extinction of their own species. They could certainly survive one more encounter with human foolishness, and so could I. The settlement money sat in my bank account, earmarked for additions to the collection, and for a security system upgrade I had been planning. I had my eye on a spectacular crinoid plate from Indiana, a colonial organism whose feathery arms had filtered food from Mississippian seas 350 million years ago. The dealer was asking $900, but he knew my story and had offered to work with me on the price. I was also planning a trip to the Badlands of South Dakota in the fall. Sarah wanted to come along, and we were going to spend a week looking for turtle shell fragments and small mammal teeth from the Oligocene. It would not yield anything dramatic, but that was not the point. The point was the search, the careful examination of ancient sediments, the patience required to spot a bit of bone among countless bits of rock. That patience, that careful attention to detail and proper procedure, was exactly what Brenda Morrison had lacked. She had wanted a quick solution to what she perceived as a problem, and she had been willing to cut corners and ignore rules to get it. That impatience and arrogance had cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and tens of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, I stood in my yard surrounded by the remnants of ancient oceans and forests, vindicated and validated. The law had worked slowly, but it had worked. Justice had not been instant, but it had been thorough. As darkness fell and the automatic lights I had installed illuminated the display, I went inside feeling more content than I had in a year. Tomorrow, I would go to campus and teach my summer course on paleontology. I would show my students pictures of my collection and tell them about the importance of proper documentation and provenance. I would probably also tell them, though in less detail, about what had happened and how I had fought to protect something that mattered to me. Because that was perhaps the most important lesson. If you do not stand up for the things you value, no one else will. Property rights, personal expression, and basic fairness are not abstract concepts. They are real principles that have to be actively defended, sometimes in court, sometimes in community meetings, sometimes just by refusing to be intimidated. The next morning, I received an unexpected email. It was from a fossil dealer in Montana I had worked with before. He had heard about what happened and wanted to do something to help. He had a small mosasaur tooth that he was willing to part with for a very reasonable price. It was not the same as the vertebra I had lost, but it was from the same family of ancient marine reptiles, and it would fit perfectly in the Cretaceous section of my display. I replied immediately that I was interested. We worked out the details, and the tooth arrived a week later, carefully packaged in layers of foam. It was beautiful, about 2 inches long, slightly curved, with the characteristic striations that marked it as coming from a predatory marine reptile that had ruled the oceans during the age of dinosaurs. I spent an afternoon preparing a mount for it, researching the best way to display it so that its features were visible, but it was protected from weather. I decided on a covered case with UV-protected glass, mounted at eye level so visitors could see the details without bending down. When I installed it in the garden, Mrs. Patterson came over to look. "That is from a sea monster, is it not?" she asked. "Essentially, yes. A mosasaur. They were the apex predators of the late Cretaceous oceans, some of them growing to over 50 feet long. This tooth came from a smaller species, probably around 20 feet long. Incredible. And to think Brenda thought these were just rocks she could throw away. Some people do not understand the value of things outside their own experience. That was her fundamental mistake." We stood there for a moment, looking at the tooth behind its glass. A relic of deep time, a product of millions of years of geology and chance preservation, now sitting safely in my front yard in Phoenix, Arizona, protected by law and community support. Life had a strange way of working out. 6 months ago, I had lost everything I had built. Now, I had not only recovered financially, but had gained something perhaps more valuable. A community that understood and supported what I was trying to do, legal precedent that protected my rights, and a renewed sense of purpose in my collecting and teaching. The Arizona summer heat was building as June turned to July, but my fossils did not care. They had survived far worse than a Phoenix summer. They had been buried in sediment, compressed under miles of rock, uplifted by tectonic forces, and eroded out by wind and water. They could handle a little heat. I could too. Whatever challenges came next, I was ready for them. I had learned that standing up for yourself, even against institutional pressure, was not just possible but necessary. I had learned that documentation and preparation matter. I had learned that most people, when presented with the facts, will do the right thing. And I had learned that rocks are never just rocks, that every stone has a story, and that some stories are worth fighting for.